Cloud9 winning the ESL Pro League Season 4 Finals not only made them the first North American lineup to win a $250,000 or more tournament in CSGO, so a big international tournament, but actually made them the first North American Counter-Strike team to win a big international tournament in 10 years and 5 months since the Complexity lineup of Fraud won the WSVG ISC event in July of 2006. Now, sure, iBuyPower, Dazed's team that actually had Skadoodle on it, had won 2 AESEA lands. One of them didn't have NIP there, it just had the guys from Very Games that, then switching over to Titan, admittedly the best team in the world, but not that much otherwise. And then the one they won after that was the one where, sure, NIP, etc. were there, but they didn't play them. They just actually beat out Cloud9, who took care of those teams for them. And so the problem is those weren't really big international tournaments. Like, by the time those lands came along, we'd actually already had the major system put in place, so we had much bigger tournaments. Those tournaments did not have a proper crowd setup or a stage. They were sort of like just playing in a tournament area for the entire match. And so they were very low key, and I think that's part of the reason some of those teams had better success. It was on NA soil, less European teams in general, and also there wasn't the same pressure and the same prestige attached as you see in big tournaments, and that's one of the reasons it's hard to win big tournaments and go deep in them. So not only was this a great storyline for North American Counter-Strike, but actually it's an important callback, an important reference point for the Cloud9 guys, because 3 of the members of this lineup, so we've got Nothing, Shroud, Skadoodle, were a part of the Cloud9 team, which in the summer of 2015 made the finals of the first ESL Pro League tournament. I mean, that was the one where obviously they got there and they were denied in epic fashion by Fnatic, who defeated them in like a really crazy 4-game final actually, but Cloud9 certainly had their chances to win, and Shroud had an insane finals actually back then, and for me was the MVP of the tournament. So the interesting thing about this is you've got to set the stage of when Cloud9 were coming in here. So obviously Cloud9 did not manage to qualify for ESL 1 Cologne, the last major, and they looked like they were absolutely at the bottom of their kind of time as a team. They also were in a situation where they'd obviously made the change. Slemmy had gone out, they'd brought in Automatic, and what happened is, in the post-major time, they're playing all these online matches in Pro League, for example, and they're winning them all. They only lose 1 match overall. They're pretty much unbeaten, so they've got this sick online streak. But you have to remember, that's actually, interestingly enough, what happened in 2015 before they went on the insane run. When they got Skadoodle and Freakazoid in, they had an insane run online as well, dominating. And then at first, they flunked, actually. They went to Gfinity, and they bombed out there. And it was only after that that they had the Pro League when they actually went off. And Pro League was what kick-started their big run. So they were looking super sick online. Then they had Northern Arena, which was basically just like a North American or an Americas tournament, because it was teams from North America, you had Immortals from South America, and you did have Heroic there. Okay, that is worth pointing out. But in general, it wasn't top European teams there. So it's mainly domestic type tournament. They came second here. Not bad. Like, they beat Heroic, but they lost in a reasonably close series against Immortals in the final. Immortals were the bigger name at the time, because Immortals had obviously won DreamHack Summer, beating NIP in the final there. Then they went to Star Series Season 2, which was a pretty stacked event. It didn't have SK, admittedly, but it had pretty much all the other big teams you wanted to see there. And at this tournament, they managed to make top 4. Unfortunately, they didn't play that many sick teams to get there, and then when they got to the semis, they did get really bodied by NIP, who went on to win the tournament. Now, first and foremost, NIP did win the tournament. Secondly, even though they got bodied on the maps, you have to look at the maps that they had to play. NIP actually is a pretty bad matchup for Cloud9, because NIP traditionally removes Mirage. In this tournament, because it was a Star Series, they were actually allowed to remove 2 maps before they picked a map. So they just removed Mirage and Train. Those are the 2 best maps of the Cloud9 lineup. And also, we know NIP likes to play Dust 2. We'll certainly play it. And Cloud9 picked Dust 2 and got straight bodied on it. So then, the top 4 there, they go to DreamHack Bucharest. They get to the playoffs. They beat Envious in a best of 3. Now, Envious is a legit team, top 10 ranked. Not world beaters at the moment, but they're legit. They get to the final, and they play Virtus Pro, and they get bodied again. They get 2-0'd. But again, you got to look at this again. First of all, Virtus Pro won the tournaments. They lost to the champions 2 times in a row. Secondly, Virtus Pro is not only a terrible matchup, but Virtus Pro is one of the elite teams in the world at that point in time. And then secondly, Virtus Pro was a terrible matchup as well, because in this particular format, we know the permaban of Virtus Pro is Dust 2, so they're not going to get to play Dust 2. And we know that Mirage and Train, the 2 maps that Cloud9 wants, Virtus Pro love these maps. And then Virtus Pro themselves have been on a heater on maps like Overpass, Cobblestone. So they're mainly Cobblestone. So they're absolutely open to playing that. And so the matchup's terrible for the guys from Cloud9, and they get bodied there. So after that, they rose up to 4th place in my rankings, something a lot of people actually didn't really agree with. But I mean, the rankings, certainly their performances merited it. And if you look at who they beat and how far they went, I think at the time it was a very inactive period. They certainly should have been ranked that high. So then they go to E-League, and you look at their group, and they should be getting out of this group. I mean, you look at it, they've got Immortals. Okay, Immortals have beaten them. Immortals is a highly ranked team as well. But they've got FaZe, who've never made it out of a group stage in 2016. And they've got Mouse Sports, who haven't made it out of many group stages, and who obviously have just lost the Oscar situation, and no one knows really how they're coming in. It's their first LAN with Lowell. So you look at that group, and you should say, right, Cloud9, you should be able to get out of this group. But actually, they failed. I mean, they played against Mouse Sports. They lost an overtime game on Dust 2. They ended up, they'd beaten Immortal FaZe on Train, with FaZe obviously first game of Carrigan. And then in the lower bracket, they had to play FaZe in the decider. They lost an overtime on Mirage, they won an overtime on Train, and they lost on Overpass. And so that was it. They were out of the group. They can't go any further in E-League, one of the massive tournaments. So unfortunately, you look at that, and if you're someone who ignored the context of how they lost to Virtus.pro and NIP and just thought they got bodied, the storyline's going to be pretty simple. People are going to say, right, they can't compete against tier 1 from Europe, and you know what else? Those, even though they were stacked tournaments, were a little bit smaller. So when they come to the big tournaments like E-League or a big 250k tournament or a major, then they're not going to perform, are they? Maybe they've got like a bit of a mortal syndrome in that particular sense. But they come to Pro League, and this is the thing, they're going to be tested here because they're in by far the toughest group. Obviously, Group A became quite whack, especially when the Fnatic came out of it, just because of how the online games played out. So they had this super tough group because, I mean, you have to look at it. They had, remember, only 3 teams get out of the group, and they have SK, like number 3 ranked team in the world, Dignitas, going to be a highly ranked team when I do my rankings because they just won the last big international tournament, and they've got NIP, who won the Star Series that Cloud9 was at. So they've already got 3 teams that everyone pretty much would favour to get out over them in the group. And then, of the 2 other teams in the group, they've got FaZe, who've just shown they're like becoming a dangerous dark horse team at E-League, and actually were able to beat Cloud9 a best of 3 there. And then, okay, NRG, sure, have shown us nothing offline, but at least have played against Cloud9 and have a sense of how to play them. So this is a really dangerous group for Cloud9, especially if they're just not a good team, and that's what people think is going to happen. They're going to get exposed. So in the group, they beat FaZe in a close Dust 2 game. They beat NRG on Cash, fair enough. Obviously, that won't be the expected. They lose to SK on Dust 2, which actually seemed quite significant because SK, obviously, Dust 2 is literally like their 5th map in the pool because they don't play Cash, they ban that. And in general, they don't want Nuke. So their 5th best map is Dust 2. So getting beaten quite heavily by SK on that's not a great sign, especially when it's like your 3rd best map. They play NIP on Dust 2, though. They beat NIP on Dust 2. And then the decider is on against Dignitas on Mirage. And they beat Dignitas here, big time game, because obviously we know what Dignitas were able to do themselves against Virtus.pro, and they managed to get out of the group with the 2nd seed. And so, if you look at this, if you beat NIP and Dignitas in a group stage, that's legit right there. You can't say that was an easy path out of the group, can you? So they go into the playoffs, and unfortunately, considering they've had a tough group, they get a very easy bracket. And so it's very easy to like look at these results and go, who gives a fuck? So they beat Optic 2-0 in the quarterfinals. They beat them on Dust 2, they beat them on Cobble, smashed them on Cobble actually, even though the old Optic was pretty good on Cobble. Then they go into the semi-finals. Again, easy opponent. They're facing Mouse Sports. Only the 2nd time Mouse Sports has ever been top 4 at a 250k or more tournament. And obviously they came out of what is a fairly whack group over in the other one. So they beat Mouse Sports 2-0. They beat them on Cobble, famously bad map for Mouse Sports. And then they play on Mirage, which is Mouse Sports' claim is their best map actually at the moment. And obviously Mouse Sports had beaten the guys from Cloud9 on Dust 2 at E-League, but they managed to beat the guys from Mouse Sports here, 2-0 them, and go into the final. So in the final, they're facing SK, the team that they played in the group, and they lost big time on Dust 2. Now, once the draws are done for the maps, you've got Overpass, Mirage, Dust 2 as the order. Now, we know SK, in general, are extremely good on Overpass. They've been very, very good. Only elite level teams beat them on that map. And SK manages to do this insane comeback after a bad T-half and actually win in overtime in ridiculous fashion. So you're wondering, is Cloud9 going to get shook by this? Are they going to get mentally destroyed? Are they going to just give up essentially? Because the next map's Mirage, and sure, Mirage is on paper statistically the best map for Cloud9, but this is a map where they've lost it to Envious already. This is a map where I think didn't they lose it to? Let me think. Yeah, they lost it overtime to FaZe at E-League, and we know, sure, The guys from SK have lost on it, but that was their original map. That was the map that built their name. And during their dominant period, the SK era of the summer, they were very strong on Mirage. Now, admittedly, Mirage was much more doable if the confidence for Cloud9 stayed high. Because actually, SK had lost their last 2 games on Mirage. They'd lost something like 3 of their last 4 or 5. Admittedly, 2 of those were to Virtus Pro and Na'Vi, who were sick on that map, and obviously monsters, number 1 and number 2 in the world right now. But even so, SK had shown some weaknesses on that, so maybe it was possible, and it is the best Cloud9 map. Cloud9 comes through with a massive stomp here. Really impressive stuff. They win that hands down. Then we go into the decider, Dust 2. Now, obviously, the key storyline here is they've already played Dust 2 against SK. SK beat them in the group on it. And in that SK era of dominance, what really set them as the sick team is after they won Columbus, they hadn't become fully dominant yet, because they went to Malmo, and they got banged out in the group stage. And one of the things is they got banged out on cash in the group stage. And so as a result, they were like, you know what, let's get cash out of the way. Let's start playing Dust 2. And when they started playing Dust 2, the other 4 maps that were above Dust 2 in their pool, they were godlike on. They were like 60, 70% win rate. But they were even able to beat most teams on Dust 2. And it's like only really sick teams could get a win on them on that. So it looked like as long as Dust 2 is good, that's like a sign that SK is in full dominance. They're incredibly dangerous. So actually, for SK to get blown out like they were getting blown out in this game, and for Cloud9 to dominate the T side like this, not only shows like nerves to bounce back from the game 1 loss, to not get shook by what happened already in the tournament on this map, it also showed that SK's really lost a step. And we know the SK era is over, like they're not winning tournaments, but at this tournament, they were expected to win, because as soon as Dignitas goes out, there is no Na'Vi, there is no VP. SK is supposed to win this tournament and like reaffirm themselves as elite tier. So actually, I think what's interesting about this is if Cloud9 hadn't won this final, then people would have said it was an easy path, because it kind of would have been once they'd got to the bracket phase. But in winning this, they did beat what was essentially the highest ranked team in the tournament. So there's also another piece of trivia that people might not know about, which is in the end of 1.6, and then actually for most of CSGO as well, every time Nothing played against Fallen's teams, he would always lose to them. And FNX was in some of those. At the end of 1.6, they'd play in like WC Pan Am and IEM American championships and shit. And the teams there, Fire Gamers, Complexity, Fallen's teams would always get them, would always beat them in the final. And then you got to a scenario in CSGO where, okay, remember the first event for Fallen and Company when they were Kaboom? It was obviously the MLG Invitational, right? Well, they upset Nothing's team there on Mirage, actually. So interesting storyline that Nothing finally got his win over them, and it was on home soil in Brazil. So what a scenario in which to win. And that's another detail to make. If you go and look at a lot of the big wins in international tournaments in the past, first of all, in CSGO, they were all in NA. And then in the history of Counter-Strike, actually, the majority of them were in NA as well. The really big results and the really deep finishes and the really big wins. There was only a couple that weren't, and that were in different regions, not NA. So that's a big deal in itself, winning in Brazil in this sense. Now, at the end of the tournament, sure, you can say Cloud9 had the easy bracket run. I mean, it's not their fault that Group A was so weak and that it ended up playing out in a very bizarre manner where people just beat each other, but as in like haphazardly. But you've got to look and say they did only lose 2 maps over the whole LAN. Both were to SK, one Dust 2 in the group stage, one incredibly close overpass in the final. So this is very legit stuff, because they played NIP, they played Dignitas, they played SK 4 times, and they only lost 2 maps. So this is very legit shit. Then you got to look at the strength of our LAN though, to put this win in context. Okay, so first and foremost, you have to say this immediately. There was no Virtus Pro and there was no Na'Vi here. 2 champions of fairly recent tournaments, the 2 highest ranked teams in the world. So that does take away some of the prestige, some of the like stacked competitive nature of the tournament. Still a very big LAN, but once you get past those 2 names, there was a lot of good teams here. I mean, people might not realize, okay, we had SK Gaming here, we had Dignitas, we had NIP, we had Cloud9 themselves, we had Immortals, we had Team Liquid, and we had Envious. Those are 7 of my top 10 ranked teams. So this is really big shit that these guys are doing this much so far, that they're winning a LAN that's got those teams there. Sure, they didn't beat, in theory, the 2 best teams, but they beat out a field that contained many of the best teams. Then you got to look at the fact that they got out of the hardest group. They beat NIP, they beat Dignitas. You got to give them credit for that. They get the easy bracket run, certainly. I mean, Optic's never done shit in bracket play. Mouse Sports have won 1 best of 3 over a full lineup that's top 10 ranked at the time in all of 2016. And that was the Astralis win at E-League. But the problem is, I actually think if they hadn't have won this final, it wouldn't really have solidified the run. You just said, okay, good performance in best of ones. You had easy run in the bracket stage. I mean, some of those teams weren't very good, weren't top 10 ranked, for example. But by beating SK in the final, that was the big result. So let's look at some of the players that were on Cloud9 in this run. Now, the obvious MVP of the tournament is automatic. This guy had a really high... forget like, oh, he was a good NA player, like some of those Stewie 2K tournaments earlier in the year where Cloud9 wouldn't do so well, but Stewie 2K would have a good individual performance and play make. No, automatic had a good tournament, like a very good tournament, on the level of the big European names as well. Sure, it's not as insane as like a Simple or a Cold Zero major, but it's pretty up there. You know, this is big time stuff. And this guy's angling. This guy's probably like a top 10 player in the world who's angling for that sort of position if he can get some more offline performances. So an obvious MVP. And the key detail about it is the nature of how he's dominated the game, because he's not getting like the most insane, crazy headshots all over the... What he is he's an insanely stable mid-round player. He always seems to be facing the right way and engaging the enemy at the right position where they're going to be. He has a very good sense for this. And if he's at mid-range with an AK, this guy is money. I mean, his AK burst and spray... really, really nice. And so it's not insane, like straight to the head, one bullets, but he's just, the spray is, if he locks it on, he gets the kill. That's just what happens with this guy. And the reason why that's so weird is because when he was in TSM, the reason why no one was like scouting this guy and demanding that he be on top teams, I mean, Team Liquid wasn't looking for this guy. The reason why is because he was playing more of a lurk role there. And actually, the lurk role didn't suit him. Funnily enough, considering he seems to have a very good intuitive sense of where to be as a mid-round player, when he put him as the lurker, he would make a lot of questionable decisions, actually. He didn't seem that good in like 1vx situations. And so it's funny how shifting someone's role over, and it's not just putting them with a new team and new teammates, but shifting someone's role over so slightly and then putting the right teammates around them can totally open someone up. And so you have to say, if it was Stewie 2K who recruited him, this is one of the pickups of the year, especially now that they've won this tournament, the first huge tournament win for NA in CSGO. Then you've got to look at Stewie 2K, because obviously he's the second best player on the team. He had been the best player before. Automatic just blossomed since he came into this lineup, but he's got strong fragging. He's got very sick spray. I actually think he's one of the better sprayers, maybe the best sprayer in NA, one of the better sprayers in the world. Really strong spray, and you see his spray transfer when he's on terrorist side and kills one guy. He just spray transfers to the next. He doesn't stop and then burst and then tap on the other ones like Scream or Shocks might do. It's full spray, but he's getting kills doing this, so he's very dangerous in that sense. And obviously, famously, because of the FPL background, very good at close quarters. He's someone also where you don't have to look at mind the fact his numbers weren't monster at this tournament, because we know he's a playmaker in this scenario. Now, if you want to talk about someone where ignore the numbers, look at the playmaking impact, you got to look at nothing, because he's been like the third guy, the hybrid. And for me, he's a guy where his numbers, his stats don't look that great for this land. They look very average. But he had much, much better impact than he's had at any time in the past on Cloud9. This guy is playmaking all over the place. He's aggressive, he's bold, he's going in. And so I think the key detail about nothing is, it's not that all the criticism of in the years gone by wasn't warranted. It was. He wasn't playing his role very well. He didn't fit around the other players. He would have very low performances for the positions he played. It's that now he's found his effective role. Somehow in this team with Stewie 2K calling, and apparently nothing has some role in making the tactics as well, now he understands his place. And I don't know if that's accepting some of the tactical aspects, so he knows what's going to be run, instead of just having Sean call it and him not listen. But he's really found his role within this team now. And I think it's nothing coming along that's actually been able to elevate this team, because, okay, Automatic's been sick since he arrived. Stewie 2K's been good for most of the year, but it's nothing arriving that's really given them the firepower, because we know the other two guys have had their problems, Shroud and Skadoodle. Now, Shroud, what's interesting is, at this tournament, considering he played a very tough group stage, he has very good numbers, actually. But you have to add in, they played, in theory, not a very hard bracket, so they got to play 4 maps there that weren't so sick. They did play against NRG in a game. So his actual numbers, I think, belie a little bit what was not as great a tournament. He did okay. He had some games that were above average. I thought he wasn't as sick once it got to some of the later stages. Obviously, he was very good on the Dust 2 game, the closing one, which will stand out in people's minds. Shroud still seems a little bit off. But at the moment, if you have to pick between the two, from what I've seen of Skadoodle, I'd be sticking with Shroud at this point in time. At least he can play some kind of a supportive or follow-up role, since he is more of a passive player anyway. The problem in Cloud9 has been Skadoodle, because throughout the group stage, he didn't have a single game where he got over 60 ADR. He was having a really poor tournament. That same went back to E-League, where he was terrible. Same to the tournaments before. Someone did a big post about this. It's called like Hellhound or something. And basically, Skadoodle's ADR and stats for the last few months have been absolutely terrible. And the problem is, he is a primary AWPer, as in one where he has the AWP every time. Famously, not very good actually with the rifle. So you've got to give him that AWP every time. So it's very expensive for your economy to have Skadoodle on the team. And he's been having problems with his AWP. I mean, okay, he had a good series against Mouse. He had really one good map that was against on Mirage. But in general, the numbers weren't bad against Mouse. He had his impact there. But okay, the problem with this guy is he's really not having that much impact with his AWP either. And so this is the problem right now. It's not a problem with this tournament because he won the tournament. But you're in a tournament with the Virtus Pros and the Navis in the world, and even more packs field, like an X-Major, for example. And dropping that AWP is going to be costly. It's gonna hit the economy. And he's not getting a lot out of the AWP at the moment. He's already been famous, even when he was a staff, having some minor weaknesses. But at the moment, his fragging's just not there. And you see way too many whiffs from what was once one of the best AWPers in the world. In fact, arguably the best AWP in the world, or a contender for it last summer. So what's the future for Cloud9 now they've won this huge tournament? Now, IEM Oakland's coming up, but they actually are not qualified for that yet. They're going to the iBuyPower Masters LAN, which that's the key deal to make. It's an offline LAN, which has a bunch of good teams there, but on like tier 2 and the odd tier 1 team. And you have to only finish top 4 to get into IEM Oakland. So I think that's very doable. In fact, you should almost say they're a lock to do that. You look at the teams there. If they get upset there, that's going to be really bring down their cachet and their status as a top team. They have to qualify for the major still, obviously, because they didn't get through to the last one. So they're going to be in a situation where that's actually going to be pretty tough, because we know that the major coming up is full of killers. So it's going to really depend on group draw there. If they get a really hard group, that's going to be tough. Well, I'm actually not certain. I mean, I assume it's going to be groups. No one's actually said if it's Swiss system or not. But that's going to be tough to get through. But certainly if they get a good group draw, it's doable. There's no more E-League, because obviously they went out of the group stage there. So the end of the year, it's going to be tough to do a whole lot more. They can possibly get into IEM Oakland. Getting into the majors is a bit tough. Aside from that, not a whole lot going for them. But obviously, what a great, big, huge result to end the year on.